This is The Writing Game, and I'm Gregory Palaci. Stories, drama, change. All are about conflict, either causing it or remedying it. Either way, conflict is an integral part of a game's creation. Even language carries conflict, as it's an imperfect rendering of our ideas in another form. So, no matter what we create, it's at odds with either the world we bring it into or its purpose in that world. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love. Martin Luther King Jr. Games, especially video games, are never without conflict. This doesn't mean they're all about shooty and the boom boom. Rather, that the conflict can be inherent in the rules putting the player at odds with the computer, or in the story where a character is at odds with the world or another character. Video games, because of their ability to handle tasks and calculations unseen and unchecked by others, are perfect for rebalancing conflicts, to weight them in the favor of the player or players, or towards itself. Whereas board and card games, because they're calculated by the players, typically are not, due to fairness. And fairness is never an aspect of conflict, though. It can be used as justification for it, but it's not a cause. Which brings us to the focus of this episode, the causes of conflicts, and how they relate to writing, storytelling, and video games. By conflict, I don't mean documented times when nation states, groups, or people are actively fighting and killing one another, though I am basing my arguments off the concepts of peace and conflict studies, and not narrative studies. So, conflict is when two or more things or parties are at odds with one another. It's a very nebulous phrase, in part because I'm talking about people, but I'm also talking about rules, logic, computers, and games. For now, though, bear with me as I go through the three types of conflicts and how they appear in video games and stories. Conflict cause 1. Resources. Nature provides us with countless examples of conflict, from plants growing to be the tallest to get the most sunlight, or their roots spreading out to collect all the water, to wolves hunting elk or fighting over territory. Resources are things both real and ethereal, the latter being something like a job. Games have characters compete for a variety of resources. They can be people, places, things, and that includes something as nominal as points. Formula 1 has you competing for money, sponsors, and pole position. Halo 5 has you competing for weapons, ammo, points, locations, kills, and to be the last one standing. No Man's Sky has you competing for resources in a more direct fashion. The harvest cycle you're perpetually stuck in has you at odds with both the Sentinels and a universe that wants to limit your ability to find and collect those resources. Competition for resources really is the most basic of drives. It's the easiest means of conflict. There are plenty of TV shows, movies, and other media where the conflict has been the main driver. The characters are all after some MacGuffin, like the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, or are competing for something, be it a job, or even the affection of another. Conflicts of these types don't have to be with anyone, or anything in particular. Existence itself creates a drive, as we see in survival games, with the need to find shelter, food, warmth, and weapons, as we do in something like The Long Dark. Writing conflicts about resources tends to mean pitting one or more characters against each other, with no option for compromise. Either one party gets the MacGuffin or no one. There's no ability to share it, as we saw at the end of The Hunger Games when Katniss and Peeta plan to take Nightlock together. More on resource conflicts in a bit. Conflict cause 2. Differing methodologies or philosophies. If you've ever worked as part of a team, then you've inevitably experienced this form of conflict to some degree or another. Anytime we're planning to do something with another person, it's easy for this sort of conflict to arise. All because we have an idea of how something should be done. When grocery shopping, do you start in the closest section? Or do you go for the bigger, heavier items first, so they're at the bottom of the cart? Do you get frozen and cold products last, or as you come to those aisles? You may want to just start in while your partner wants a more systematic approach to loading your cart. Instant conflict of methodologies. Batman and I disagree on a lot of things, namely how he uses his time and resources to fight crime. He fights crime at a low level, rather than using his billions and his business to remedy the causes of inequality as well as systemic issues to leave crime as the only alternative for people in need. Whereas he wants to punch them till they stop. Neither method can be seen to reduce crime immediately, in part because Batman is only working to apprehend criminals after the fact. And my method is about providing people better opportunities so crime isn't considered an option. Using one's fist may be immediately satisfying, whereas combating the causes and not the symptoms is smarter economically, but not as kinetically satisfying. Games do offer a variety of philosophies or methods to completing a task. Simulation and strategy games are prime examples, but their variety of ways for players to interact doesn't mean there's a conflict. Rather, that's left to the story in a game. We see competing methodologies or philosophies occur in a number of ways through games. The first would be through the antagonist. Professor X and Magneto have opposing philosophies and methodologies throughout the majority of X-Men comics, cartoons, and movies. Both want acceptance and to live free, but one wants to do that through peaceful means and the other by fighting. Of course, there are times when both Professor X and Magneto encounter a mutual adversary, aligning them so they are more rivals rather than antagonists, with the new party taking place of the antagonist. See William Stryker from X2, for example. Thus, rivals are the second way we see conflicts arise. In the case of rivals, neither party is necessarily characterized as evil or bad. Rather, they're each competing for the same thing, and we see this in every genre. Romance stories with multiple suitors, action and comedy has characters chasing a MacGuffin, thrillers and capers with criminals going after the same target. There are countless examples of this very thing. Oddly, the example that jumps to mind for me first is the Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sinbad flick, Jingle All The Way. Make of that what you will. In games, we see conflicts between philosophies and methodologies most often occur between party members in RPGs. The Baldur's Gate series and most BioWare RPGs have this mechanic to some degree or another. Some of them make it so if you have a particular party member, then you can't have others. In other games, it's your team's reputation is too high or low, then you can't group with potential party members. Dating sims are the other big time when differing methodologies and philosophies are causes of conflicts. Of course, it's never seen in such a light. Rather, it's a matter of saying the wrong thing, making the wrong decision, and you'll deny yourself one of the potential romantic partners. But that's because they are meant to have disagreed with you on a philosophical level. That's the story justification for it. Or it's a result of our third cause of conflicts. Conflict cause 3. Unmet Expectations. When it comes to dating sims and other games trying to simulate the relationships, part of those relationships are the expectations characters have. When someone acts against those expectations, that's when conflict occurs. So we get the potential partners being turned off or dismayed by the player's choices. We all find ourselves in conflict with others when we have expectations about how they'll behave. If it's someone close to us, then more often than not, that conflict is bigger than if it's some stranger on the street. Of course, we may be more explosive and confrontational with the stranger if there are other issues under the surface simmering. Our expectations result in assumptions and misunderstandings. We assume certain things will happen, and we can misunderstand the motivations of people and groups. Our personal ability to roll with unmet expectations and changes affects how we react, but that's not stories or storytelling. For that, we should look at multiplayer games, like League of Legends. Part of the toxicity of that game comes from the expectations players have of their teammates. If someone doesn't kill a creep or an opposing player as expected, then they're apt to respond harshly and may incite a conflict with their own teammate. In that case, it's poor behavior and a lack of coping mechanisms that account for the conflict, along with a culture that allows such behavior to continue. But again, that's not necessarily the conflict we see in stories or games. It's one around games and games culture, but not within the game itself. That's because focusing on conflicts that arise from expectations require intimate stories, and for that to happen, you need in-depth characterization. Take, for example, my perennial favorite games to mention, Firewatch and Gone Home. The conflicts between the characters in those games is one of expectations. Henry in Firewatch expects Delilah to act a certain way, and to have his back as she's his supervisor, supposed friend, and confidant. The conflict arises, never overtly mind you, as the situation increasingly fails to resemble the facts that Delilah is telling you. So both you as the player and Henry as the player character are in conflict with the world and your only source of contact. All because we assume we can trust Delilah and expect her to tell us the truth. In Gone Home, while the player character Katie Greenbrier is never in conflict with the world or any other characters, we still experience a story in which the other characters, Katie's mother, father, and sister, are in conflict with one another and themselves. Each of the other Greenbriers has expectations for the others and, to some degree, themselves. Janice, the mother, expects a certain amount of romance and attention from Terry, her husband. Terry expects to be a successful writer, while both parents expect Samantha, the youngest daughter, to go to college after high school and presumably be heterosexual. And Samantha has expectations for her girlfriend and potential future with Lonnie. In games, the closest we get to not meeting expectations involves random numbers, or dice rolls, when we're not playing against other players. It's the frustration we feel upon completing a raid in Destiny 2, only to get some crappy loot. Or when we miss a shot with a 82% chance of hitting in Xcom 2. It's minute and it's limited in its effects on the story, because generally we have a chance of recovering or getting the loot later. As writers, we can do more for our game. We can layer the conflicts. Layering conflicts sounds easy, but it requires forethought, and if not some outlining, then definitely editing, because everything requires editing, in part to make sure all of the conflicts within the story are clearly indicated. That's not to say they have to be spelled out for the player. Give them some credit. They do pick up a lot of what you're implying through dialogue, characterization, lore, etc. Of course, it helps if art and gameplay reiterate and support the conflicts of the story. But for there to be conflict caused by expectations, then more often than not, your game is going to require multiple characters. Not necessarily for the player to inhabit, but for them to interact with. Expectations are great ways of allowing for plot twists, but they can lead to some characters being little more than tropes. More on that in a future episode. Antagonists can be the perfect mirror to the protagonist or player character. Nope, the two aren't always the same, but again, more on that in a future episode. The differing philosophies or methodologies can put them at odds, especially if they're competing for resources. At this point, I should point to a good example of a video game antagonist, but I'm struggling to fit one that fits this argument, and not just a video game antagonist that makes for a good boss fight. Part of the reason for my struggle is how one-dimensional most villains or antagonists are presented as, especially in relation to the player character. In the most recent Wolfenstein games, we've seen Wilhelm Strasse and Irene Engel as both vile and contemptuous characters who are both unremorseful and irredeemable. Not to mention, they're Nazis. And while there are times when they and the player character, BJ Blazkowicz, are after the same resources, they are diametrically opposed in terms of philosophies, insofar as the Nazis are fascists, murdering assholes, and Blazkowicz and the resistance aren't. But in those games, there's never a conflict of expectations between those villains and the player character. Those conflicts are reserved for intra-team drama, such as Irene Engel's issues with her daughter Sigrun Engel. The Wolfenstein games ups its writing by layering such conflicts not just upon the Nazis, but the resistance. Blazkowicz is confronted by the racism inherent in America and how it so readily led to the invasion and welcoming of the Nazis. That any successful overthrow of the Third Reich is going to require change too on the part of American citizens. A return to the status quo before the war isn't enough. In the end, the conflicts in your game and your story are going to be varied, and should be so. It provides not just a depth of character, but the ability for the player to explore and experience more in terms of theme, plot, and potentially even gameplay. For now, thanks for watching and listening. I've been Gregory Plagy, and this is The Writing Game. Everything I do can be found at onegamedad.com or on Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube at OneGameDad. You can also support me on Patreon at OneGameDad. And if you're interested or you need someone to write your game, hey, contact me. The Writing Game is hosted by Third Culture Kids, my company, which can be found at thirdculturekids.net. Please be sure to like and subscribe or rate and review this show on whatever platform you find it. I'll see you on the next episode. Bye for now.